In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention from the post-Roman experience in Gaul to the situation in Italy in the 5th and 6th centuries. The Italian story differs from that of Gaul, largely because Gaul was a place from which the Roman forces could retreat. And so Gaul could be given up to the Goths to make peace, as it was to a degree in 418. It could be something that the Franks were allowed to expand into in 407. It was a part of the Roman state, but the Roman state could somehow manage to get on without it. But this was not the case with Italy. The Western imperial court was centered in the city of Ravenna, which you see on the top of this map. And in many ways, that state was the Western Roman Empire. And because of this, if Italy were to fall, whatever that term means, then there would be no Western Roman government left. But with that said, emperors, even though Italy was the frame of reference and the centerpiece of their state, emperors did a great deal to cause problems for the Roman state in Italy. So we've already seen how much of a mess Anorius made of things in Italy, and Anorius is certainly important. But as we get into the 5th century, the most important figure in the middle decades of the 5th century was Honorius's half-sister, Gala Plecidia. Now, Gala has a remarkable personal story. Gala first comes to our attention following the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410. At this point, Gala is probably about 18 years old, so she's a relatively young adult princess, and she's captured in the sack, and then she follows the Visigoths as they pillage through Italy and southern Gaul. And eventually, she marries Atholf, the Gothic king who was chosen after the death of Alaric. She tries then to cooperate with him and to convince her half-brother Anorius to make a deal with the Goths. And as we've seen, Anorius really sort of refuses to do this until eventually in 415, the Goths trade Gala Plecidia, the wife of their king, to Honorius's court in exchange for food and supplies for the Gothic forces. So we have to already imagine what this is going to feel like for Gala Plecidia. And when she returns, Gala is then married to a man named Constantius, who's the commander of the Western Roman forces. And he was briefly elevated to the position of co-emperor alongside Honorius. She has a child almost immediately, but Constantius dies in 421, and Honorius forces Gala and her young child, who's eventually going to become the Emperor Valentinian III, to go into exile in Constantinople. And Anorius then dies a little less than 2 years later in the year 423. Now, when Honorius dies, Valentinian III is supposedly the legal heir of Honorius. But before he could return to Italy, a usurper named Ioannis arises up and claims imperial power. And this prompts a civil war. Now, Ioannis had attracted support from some Italians, and he also managed to attract some support from the Huns. And the Huns then send a group of troops to support Ioannis under the command of a man named Aetius. Now, Aetius, in this context, is of course different from the 4th century theologian Aetius. Same name, different person. But before Aetius and his Hunnic troops could arrive to reinforce Ioannis, Gala Plecidia, with her young son Valentinian III in tow, arrive with a group of soldiers from Constantinople. They depose Ioannis, and they make Valentinian, who at this point is a very young child, emperor of the West. But Gala Plecidia had the real power. And so when Aetius finally arrives with his Hunnic forces, he agrees to serve under Valentinian III as his main commander, but he also kept the support of the Huns. Now, the reign of Valentinian III is a relatively long one. He's in power for nearly 30 years, but it's dominated by the contest between Gala Plecidia and Aetius. And this goes back to the dynamic we talked about a few lectures ago. This dynamic of an imperial figurehead with military and court figures jostling for real control beneath him. Now, at times, Gala, who of course commanded not the military side of this, but the court side of this, appeared to have the upper hand. And so in the early 430s, for example, she actually gets Aetius exiled, and he's replaced temporarily until he returns with a group of Hunnic soldiers. But most of the time, Gala, Plecidia, and Aetius had to coexist. And this is because both of them are really good at what they do. Gala is a really, really savvy operator. And of course, the experience of being kind of bought and sold as a child makes her savvy, it makes her very worldly, and it makes her very capable of assessing situations and understanding how they can run to her benefit. But Aetius is also formidable. Aetius is the most effective general that the Western Empire has to offer, and he's really good at protecting Roman possessions in Italy, in Gaul, and in what's now basically Croatia from barbarian attack. And the major threat that Aetius has to confront is actually coming from the Huns. Aetius himself had close ties to the Hunnic king Rua, and Rua had ruled until 434 and generally was supportive of Aetius. And in return, Aetius looked away as he absorbed territory that the Romans nominally controlled but really couldn't defend. But when Rua died, he was succeeded by Attila. And of course, we all know Attila. Now, Attila consolidated his power and then began a large offensive designed to take a great deal of Roman territory. Now, when the Huns take territory, what they tend to do is set up a tributary system where the people in that territory pay into a central Hunnic administration. And so what Attila was really looking to do was to generate money for his followers. And if that meant conquering territory, that was great. If it also meant being paid off, that was great too. And what the Eastern Empire tended to do was to pay Attila off and turn his attention towards the West. And so what this meant was Aetius really needed to put together a defense against Attila because the West lacked the resources that the East had, plus Attila didn't have anywhere to go after the East had paid him off. So he had to go west. And Aetius was really the only person who could organize this defense. And so in 451, in one of the great battles of the 5th century, Aetius cobbled together a coalition force of Romans, Visigoths, Burgundians, and other barbarian groups in the west. And the force met Attila at what's called the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, and it won a great victory. And this victory was Aetius's. It was he who had done the diplomatic work to build the coalition. It was he who did the actual work of military commanding. And because Gala Placidia had died in 450, this would seem to be a triumph that should cement Aetius's position at the center of Roman administration. He should be the voice that is listened to by the figurehead Emperor Valentinian III. And there's a lot of reasons to think why this should have been. His loyalty was rather clear. He'd been serving the Roman state and had been doing so for nearly 30 years. He defeated the Huns in battle, so the idea that he's too friendly with the Huns is really not a factor anymore. But in an act of extreme stupidity, Valentinian III was convinced to kill Aetius, and he did it himself, in person, because his friends in court had convinced him that Aetius was treacherously going to betray him. And this was a really significant problem, because the arrangements that Aetius had made to secure the health and safety of the Western Roman Empire depended as much on the personal guarantees that he gave diplomatically as it did on the military capacity of the state that he was able to marshal and deploy. And the problem that Valentinian faced was, of course, he had been emperor for almost 30 years at this point, but he had very little actual experience in governing. He governed through other people. And so what this meant was when Aetius died, the people who had convinced him to do this, the aristocrats who hoped to benefit from Aetius' death, rebelled, and the soldiers and others loyal to Aetius joined them, and Valentinian III himself was murdered in March of 455. And so the death of Aetius almost directly leads to the death of Valentinian. But also, in June of 455, the Vandal king, Gaiseric, who controlled territory in North Africa, we'll talk about in the next lecture, sacked Rome because diplomatic relationships that had been built under Aetius had frayed, and a marriage alliance that had been promised was walked back. And so the response to this was to sack the city of Rome. And basically, after the sack of Rome and the death of Valentinian III, central authority in the West did not really recover. There wasn't an emperor powerful enough to assert his own authority after this. And what you get is a sequence of barbarian commanders of the armed forces putting up a succession of emperors and deposing them when they got tired of that emperor or when they needed somebody to be the fall guy. And this is a really significant shift. Up until the period of the Kinderkaisers, the period following the death of Theodosius I, when these children emperors were put in place, emperors lasted longer than commanders. In fact, commanders were supposed to cycle through their offices relatively regularly, and emperors were supposed to be persistent and constant. And then as you move into the regimes of the young emperors of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the dynamic shifts a little bit. There is a lot of shifting underneath the emperors, but the emperors don't really fall. But with the period after 455, what happens is the emperors shift as kind of figureheads put in place by barbarian commanders who remain a constant presence in the administration of the empire. And in the West, the barbarian commander who occupies this position is a man named Ricimer. And so Ricimer is able to make and unmake emperors for much of the rest of the 450s and through the 460s. Until finally in 467, the Eastern Emperor Leo inserts a Greek aristocrat named Anthemius as the new Western Emperor. And his hope was that with Eastern support, Eastern troops, and Eastern money, Anthemius can actually stabilize the situation in the West and create something like a real imperial regime again. And to help solidify this, Leo organized a military campaign with Anthemius and a naval commander in the Balkans named Marcellinus. And this offensive was supposed to be launched against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in 468. When it was launched, initially there was some success, but despite these auspicious beginnings, the Roman commanders didn't press the advantage they had, and the attack against the Vandals in 468 ended in a colossal failure that was extremely costly. Our sources say that the Eastern Empire alone spent 130,000 pounds of gold and 700,000 pounds of silver in building up this campaign, and so it was a real setback for both empires, but especially so for the West, because the loss of these resources in this attack on the Vandals meant that the East could no longer provide Anthemius with the military support he depended upon, and Ricimer was still bouncing around. And so by 472, Ricimer was able to overthrow Anthemius. Even though there was a marriage alliance binding Ricimer to Anthemius, this didn't mean anything to a figure like Ricimer, who felt compelled to play kind of hardball politics whenever possible. And so following the fall of Anthemius, he's killed and replaced by another sequence of short-lived puppets of the Western court. But despite all of this chaos at the top of the empire, Roman authority held on in Italy. This remained a Roman Empire. It remained a state that was nominally controlled by Romans. The Roman Senate made decisions about how the city of Rome was run, and Roman law governed the entire way that the empire functioned. But what we see is the Roman army is increasingly in the hands of barbarian leaders. And with the exception of Anthemius during this initial period when he's supported by the East, Western Roman emperors are dominated by their Germanic military commanders. And so it was in one way only a matter of time before they were replaced altogether. And in 476, this finally is done. And it's done by a man named Odoacer. Now, Odoacer is a general of mixed Hunnic descent who uses a troop grievance about getting land grants in Italy to overthrow the last Roman emperor. And this is described most famously in this source, a chronicle written in the 6th century by a man named Marcellinus Comus. And he writes about this. He writes about it like this. He says, Odoacer, the king of the Goths, took control of Rome. Odoacer slew Orestes right there. Odoacer condemned Augustulus, the son of Orestes, with the penalty of exile in Lucullanum, a castle in Campania. And the Western Roman Empire of the Roman people, which the first emperor Octavian Augustus had begun to rule in the 709th year from the foundation of the city, perished with this Augustulus. And this happened in the 522nd year of the reign of the departed emperors, while Gothic kings subsequently held Rome. Now, there's a lot of things that are very interesting about this passage. Now, the event that this describes is a military coup by Odoacer that overthrew the previous military commander in charge of Roman forces in Italy. This is a man named Orestes. Now, what Orestes had done in 475 is he had led a coup against the person in charge of the Roman regime in Italy, a man named Julius Nepos. And Nepos had not died in this coup, he'd actually retreated to Croatia. And so Orestes, following the coup against Nepos, had raised up his son, Romulus Augustulus, as the figurehead emperor. And when Odoacer led a coup against Orestes, he overthrew Orestes and killed Orestes, but Romulus Augustulus was a figurehead emperor, and Odoacer didn't want to deal with him, because as the son of Orestes, Romulus was of course not a reliable partner for Odoacer. But he also didn't want to raise a figurehead of his own. And so what Odoacer did was he overthrew Romulus Augustulus, he killed Orestes, and he sent Romulus off into, basically, he pensioned him off into retirement, even though Romulus Augustulus was still a child. And he gave him an annual salary, he gave him a castle in Campania where he could live, and the last Roman emperor of the West to reign in Italy, a man named Romulus Augustulus, spent the rest of his life living in exile on a state pension in Campania. So this is what actually happened. But what we see in Marcellinus's account is something that is very, very misleading. Because first of all, Marcellinus says Odoacer is a king of the Goths. He's no such thing. He's a king of nobody, and he's not a Goth at all. He's also wrong to assert that this represented the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because Julian Nepos is still alive. The person who is recognized in the East as the Western Emperor is still there. He's still in Western territory. He's just not in Italy. And so a contemporary account of Odoacer's coup is different from this 6th century account. Marcellinus is writing almost 45 years after this event happens. But we do have a source that comes from the East that is contemporary, more or less, with this. It's a 5th century source, not a 6th century source. And it says that what actually happened was that Augustus, the son of Orestes, this is Romulus Augustulus, heard that Zeno had driven out Basiliscus and regained sovereignty of the East, and he compelled the Senate to send an embassy to Zeno proposing that there was no need of a divided rule and that one shared emperor was sufficient for both territories. And they said, moreover, that they had chosen Odoacer, a man of military and political experience, to safeguard their affairs, and that Zeno should confer upon him the rank of patrician and entrust him with the government of Italy. And to those who'd come from the Senate, Zeno gave the following reply. They'd received 2 emperors from the East. One of them they had ejected, that's Nepos. The other, Anthemius, they had killed. Now he said they knew what they should do. Since their emperor, meaning Nepos, was still alive, they should entertain no other thought than to welcome him on his return. And Zeno added that he congratulated Odoacer in this beginning by preserving the order of government appropriate for the Romans. So in the 5th century, what we are told happened was that Romulus Augustulus agreed to step aside and told the Senate to send a message to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, saying that there shouldn't be 2 emperors anymore. There should instead just be one emperor, Zeno, and that Zeno should trust the guidance of the Roman Senate in the West to entrust control of actual affairs in Italy to Odoacer, a man who would serve as the delegate who reported directly to Zeno. And so there wouldn't be divided imperial rule at all. Officially, there would be only one emperor. That emperor would be Zeno. And Odoacer would report to Zeno, and Odoacer would serve at the command of Zeno, and therefore what you would have is not two imperial courts with two emperors, but one imperial court that delegated authority over Italy to Odoacer. And what the East then says is very interesting. The East says, we don't recognize the legitimacy of Romulus Augustulus anyway. And so this request is not something that we can agree to because we still recognize Nepos as the Roman emperor in the West. And so we don't acknowledge that there should be only one emperor. We acknowledge that there should be two emperors, and we say to you that you should acknowledge Nepos as your emperor. And Odoacer can do what Odoacer does, but he should acknowledge Nepos as his emperor and not just say there's only one emperor, it's Zeno, and I will run things through Zeno. But the upshot of this is the contrast between what Marcellinus Comus says in the 6th century and what Malchus says in the 5th century. And the contrast is very clear. Marcellinus says the Western Empire has fallen with Odoacer's coup. There is no more Western Empire. It's over. Malchus says, well, the West is still Roman. It is still part of the empire. It is still an empire, and Nepos should be recognized as emperor. And so in the 6th century, the argument is whether Italy is still Roman. And Marcellinus says it's not. It's no longer Roman territory. It's controlled by a king of the Goths. Malchus in the 5th century says, no, Italy is still Roman, quite obviously, and the only question is what emperor should be in charge of it. And so the argument has shifted in that period. But in 476, the perspective that Marcellinus Comus is developing, that the Roman Empire fell in 476, is not something that anybody is really saying. Instead, what we get is a reality where Odoacer rules things as he said he would. He rules this territory as territory that is Roman territory governed by Odoacer in the name of the Eastern Empire. And so what Odoacer does is he continues to issue coins in the name of these emperors. So Nepos, there are coins issued of Nepos during this period. And then later, after Nepos dies, there are coins issued in the name of Zeno by Odoacer. Odoacer did things that were very consistent with somebody who's running things as a Roman. So Odoacer did things like renovate the Colosseum. He paid for the rebuilding of the city of Rome. And under his authority, Italy thrived. But the East was not comfortable with this. The East was not happy with the fact that Odoacer was in charge. And the East actually even at one point sponsored an attack on Odoacer by a barbarian group called the Rugians. And what happened in the aftermath of this is quite interesting. Odoacer, using the military forces of what was still, in his view, the Western Roman territory, defeated the Rugians, and because Odoacer won this victory in the name of Rome, he sent a message congratulating Zeno. Zeno, who had paid the Rugians to attack Odoacer, he sent a message congratulating Zeno on the great victory that Odoacer had won in Zeno's name against barbarians attacking the Romans. And so Odoacer had enough sense to troll Zeno, and Zeno was forced to actually acknowledge this and congratulate Odoacer on the victory that he had won in a war that Zeno had actually instigated against Odoacer himself. But as you get into the later part of, well, as you get into the 490s, we see the East marshals an even more effective counter to Odoacer's regime. And this consists of an attack by a group of Goths commanded by the Gothic king Theodoric. This is an image of Theodoric. And so Theodoric had first attacked Constantinople, and he had no hope of breaching the walls of Constantinople, the most formidable fortress in the ancient world. In fact, when you think of the walls of Constantinople, there's a great quote in a work by the historian Anthony Caldelis, where he says that in antiquity there are really three categories of fortifications. There's cities that are not defended and not fortified. There are cities that are fortified, and then there's Constantinople. And so when Theodoric attacks Constantinople, he has no hope of taking the city. And he's very willing to be bought out. And what the East says is, you can't take our capital, but why don't you go to Italy and attack Odoacer, and we will sanction this because we don't actually support the regime of Odoacer. And so in 491, in 489, Theodoric invades. By 491, he's won enough victories that Odoacer is holed up in the city of Ravenna. And then he comes to a power-sharing agreement with Theodoric, where in 493, Odoacer and Theodoric agree to share power. And then 10 days after this agreement is signed, at a dinner party, Theodoric attacks Odoacer, kills Odoacer, and the power-sharing agreement is done because Theodoric has now taken power for himself. Now, despite this initial act of brutality, and the civil war with Odoacer was a significant civil war that inflicted real damage on Italy, afterwards Theodoric follows a policy of cooperation with the Romans who remain in Italy, and he also embarks on positions and initiatives to rebuild and repair Italy from the damage of this civil war. He defines his position as, again, a patrician who's subject to the Eastern Emperor. And so he continues the process of issuing coins with Eastern Roman emperors on them. Occasionally issues things, and this is a medallion that he issues with his own picture on it, but you can see that what he's doing here is not asserting imperial power. He describes himself as Rex Theodoricus. And this is, again, an acknowledgement of his authority in Italy, but also not an attempt to assert imperial status for himself. He's still subordinate to the Eastern Roman Emperor. And his propaganda then uses Roman terms to describe what his power actually is. So his propaganda describes him as a second Trajan or a second Valentinian. He governs using Roman law. He allows things like the consulship to continue. The Senate continues to meet. He makes use of Roman officials appointed and Roman officials who rise through the Senate. Goths clearly control matters in Italy, but for most of his reign, Theodoric tries very carefully to work closely with the existing Roman aristocracy. And one of the main figures he works with is a man named Boethius. So here you see coinage issued by Theodoric, and you see this is still coinage showing the Emperor Zeno with Theodoric's medallion in the early 6th century. Here you have an image of the consul Boethius. And Boethius is one of these Western senatorial figures who cooperates very closely with Theodoric. Now, Boethius comes from a great senatorial family, and he was a philosopher who read Greek fluently. And sensing the difficulty that Latin speakers would have in accessing Greek philosophy in these new kind of unsettled times, Boethius begins a project to translate all of Plato and Aristotle into Latin. And Boethius not only translates these works, but he also creates commentaries so that people looking at and reading these texts can interact with them and understand what they're all about. Now, Boethius's project is why Aristotle is preserved in the Western Middle Ages. He does not get through Plato. But what we have from Boethius is an indication that in the early 6th century, under Theodoric, the Gothic king in Italy, there's still not only the capacity to access the Greek philosophical tradition, but also very much the willingness to do this in a way that reflects contemporary Greek understandings of what this tradition means. And so Boethius is not just finding a bunch of manuscripts that no one has looked at for 200 years and translating them to the best of his ability. Boethius is fully conversant with the philosophical interpretive tradition of these texts. And so when Boethius is accessing this material, it is very much a living tradition. And Boethius is part of the reason why this tradition carries on into the Middle Ages. But Boethius is also a senator. And so Boethius is not just an ivory tower intellectual who doesn't do anything. Instead, he's a very important figure in the regime of Theodoric. He is made consul by Theodoric, and Theodoric, for a lot of the time that Boethius is alive, leans very heavily on Boethius as a figure who can help him govern Italy effectively. Now, a different sort of individual is the figure Cassie Doris. Now, Cassiodorus is also a Roman senator. He's also from a Roman senatorial family, and he also served as a high official under Theodoric. But whereas Boethius's role is, in a sense, a mediating role that helps Theodoric interact effectively with the Senate, Cassiodorus serves as the official person who writes the letters that Theodoric sends out. He's the quaestor. He's the man who takes Theodoric's wishes and puts them in eloquent Latin that is consistent both with legal norms and also the stylistic expectations that one has of Latin coming from the imperial court, or from, in this case, the royal court of the king, the Gothic king in charge of Italy. Now, many of the letters that Cassiodorus writes on Theodoric's behalf are preserved. And what they show is that Cassiodorus very much believes that this is a Roman regime, working in a Roman fashion, under Roman laws, and Cassiodorus is not shy about contrasting the Romanness of Theodoric's regime with the post-Roman barbarian identity of some of the other Western kings that Theodoric interacts with. So a good example of this is a letter that Cassiodorus wrote on Theodoric's behalf to Gundobad, the king of the Burgundians. And it's a wonderful piece of kind of passive-aggressive condescension. And so this is a letter that accompanies a royal gift coming from Italy to the Burgundian kingdom. And the Burgundian kingdom is centered in Geneva. And so Cassiodorus writes, I have decided to send you, with the usual friendship, the timepieces with their operators, to give pleasure to your intelligence, so that you can possess in your home country what you once saw in the city of Rome. And let these water clocks fix the hours with precision, because the order of life becomes confused if the separation of the hours is not truly known. And indeed, it's the habit of beasts to feel the hours by their belly's hunger, and to be unsure of something, which namely is time, which was obviously granted for human purposes. And so what this shows is something that's quite important. Cassiodorus is writing on behalf of the barbarian king Theodoric to the barbarian king Gundobad. But the barbarian king Gundobad is controlling a post-Roman kingdom. It's a barbarian kingdom on territory that was once Roman but now is not. But Theodoric is still Roman. He controls Rome. He controls the central elements of civilization in the West, and they are still Roman. And so this enables Theodoric to contrast the Romanness of Italy under his control with the barbarianness of Burgundy under Gundobad's control. And so he does this by sending a gift that highlights the technological sophistication that Rome still possesses and the falling that you see in these areas beyond Roman control. And if you think back to Ammianus's descriptions of what barbarians are, they are beasts, they are animals, they are subhuman. And this is the language that Cassiodorus is very much still using here. The Burgundians, even though they control territory that was once Roman, are beasts who don't tell time because they don't have the technological sophistication to do so. Instead, they kind of sense time based on when they're hungry, like animals. But Theodoric's regime in Italy is Roman, it's civilized, it's not barbaric, because they use technology to organize their time, not this animalistic sense of urge and this animalistic desire to get fed because it's time to be fed because they're hungry. And so what you see here is a very, very strong assertion of Romanness by someone working for this barbarian king. Who exists as the sovereign governing a territory that is still very much Roman. And this underlines something that's quite important. Theodoric's state was inclusive, and it was built on a Roman model, and it framed itself very much as a Roman state. But the religious divisions that we saw in some of the post-Roman states in the West are very real in Theodoric's Italy, because Theodoric's Ostrogoths are Arians. And because of this, the religious activities that they sponsored were done in separation from the Catholic majority in Italy. And so in Theodoric's capital of Ravenna, they're constructed two sets of buildings to occupy and to serve as the centers of worship for these distinctive communities. One of them is an Arian set of ecclesiastical buildings, and the other is a Catholic set of ecclesiastical buildings. And so Theodoric had inherited a city in which Catholic Christians had their own splendid cathedrals and affiliated buildings. And so what we see here is a great example of one of these buildings. This is the baptistry, the Orthodox baptistry that was used for baptisms of Catholics in Ravenna in the late 5th, early 6th centuries. And what you see here is an image of baptism showing Jesus being baptized in the Jordan River. The little figure in the water is a personification of the Jordan River. Jesus is standing there. You see the dove coming down, symbolizing the bestowal of baptism on Jesus, and then you have John the Baptist standing to the side, and they're surrounded by all of the different apostles and other figures associated with Christianity and the central sort of beginnings of Christianity. And so what you see in the Orthodox baptistry here is a close-up of the baptism itself, and then here are representations of prominent Christian figures associated with that confession. Now the Arian baptistry shows something slightly different. What we see is the dove again, but the imagery is slightly different. And people have argued about what we can take away from this. What can we understand about how the Arian Christians under Theodoric understood baptism based on the difference between the scene we see here, where John the Baptist is putting the water on Jesus, and the scene we see here, where the dove seems to be putting the water on Jesus? And the short answer is nobody's really figured that out. But what we see is the iconography is different. It does represent this in a slightly different fashion. And so what we see is a difference, not a significant difference, but a difference where the iconography in these baptistries likely represents some sort of theological difference in how we understand baptism done in an Arian context and baptism done in a Catholic context. Now, what we also can understand is the favoring of Arianism by Theodoric's regime is something that can very much produce conflict if necessary. And we do see that there is some tension between the ecclesiastical authorities of the Catholic Church and Theodoric. But it's not incredibly pronounced. This is not what, say, Yorick does when he conquers southern Gaul, instituting a persecution, killing or separating or deposing bishops, Catholic bishops in this territory, and creating an Arian church structure to replace them. And so there's tension, but there's not tension on that level. But second, and perhaps more interesting, is that there is a group of Italian exiles in Constantinople who are upset with Italy under Gothic control. And they found allies in family members who are associated with some of the elites who work for Theodoric and help promote his regime. Most notably the family of Boethius, a family that has branches in Theodoric's Italy, but also branches in Constantinople. And what's even more interesting is that we see Latin speakers in Constantinople begin pressuring Constantinople to see Theodoric's regime as not Roman. Now, this is not an Italian perspective. This is very much a Constantinopolitan perspective. But it's in this context that Marcellinus Comus's description of the fall of the West and the fall of the Western Roman Empire first emerges. It emerges in these communities of Latin-speaking people, Italian exiles, and also Latin speakers from the Balkans who are sympathetic to their perspective. And it's with this group that the idea that in 476 the deposition of Romulus Augustulus leads to the fall of the Roman Empire to Goths takes form. Marcellinus' chronicle that lies about Odoacer and says he's a Goth and lies about the representation of this event as the fall of Rome, this reflects a very strong sense that the East should intervene and it should fix the damage that was done when Rome fell. this is not a Western perspective. This is not a view that anyone in Italy has. It's a Constantinopolitan perspective that comes out of the views of people who have left Italy because they are not happy with Theodoric's regime and they want the East to feel the compulsion to intervene and overthrow a regime that they hope they can frame as illegitimate and not Roman. Now, these pressure groups are not alone, but for much of the early part of the 6th century, they don't really receive much of a hearing. But as Theodoric's regime proceeds, Theodoric begins to get more concerned about the loyalty of the Romans in Italy who are serving under him, and the groups in Constantinople begin getting more and more attention, in part because these two factors work with each other to heighten the tension between the East and the West. The pressure groups in Constantinople and the behavior of Theodoric kind of reinforce each other, and Theodoric gets more and more suspicious as he realizes that the Constantinopolitan exiles are getting more attention, and the Constantinopolitan exiles get more attention because Theodoric starts behaving in ways that make their appeals seem more pressing and make their representation of what's going on in the West more convincing. And by the later part of Theodoric's reign, Theodoric makes a couple of mistakes that really lend credence to the perspective in Constantinople that Theodoric is not behaving in a way that is sympathetic to Romans. He's not behaving like a Roman sovereign. He's instead behaving like a Gothic king who is not Roman anymore and whose regime is not Roman anymore. And the biggest mistake that he makes is to imprison Boethius and Boethius's kin, a man named Symmachus, a descendant of the Symmachus who framed the Altar of Victory controversy. Now, the Consolation of Philosophy is a text that Boethius writes when he's imprisoned, and it's a really, really powerful text. The Consolation of Philosophy is something that, in a sense, is Boethius speaking and thinking about his situation as a political prisoner under Theodoric, as a former consul, as a Roman, but also as a figure who has great cultural capital, and now is calling upon both his great individual status as a Roman aristocrat, but also his cultural status as a sophisticated Greek thinker. And the Consolation of Philosophy highlights the unjust and unreasonable imprisonment of Boethius. And so in the Consolation, what Boethius does is he writes a text that is designed to allow him to process his experience of being a political prisoner, and to do it in a fashion where he engages in dialogue with a personification of philosophy herself. Now, this is a text that, of course, talks very intimately about his experience. And it speaks very intimately about what it means to be a political prisoner. But the Consolation of Philosophy also does something else that's quite important. Because not only does it relate to the political narrative of Theodoric's regime, and especially these moments late in Theodoric's regime where the collaboration with Roman aristocrats is starting to break down in this climate of mutual suspicion, where Theodoric fears that the aristocrats are appealing to the East, and he fears their loyalty, and the aristocrats fear being made examples of by Theodoric in this kind of politically motivated imprisonment and execution. But the text also says something else that's quite important, because Boethius is the last Latin philosopher of antiquity. He is the last person who forms this living link to the Greek philosophical tradition, and the Consolation of Philosophy is the last text that he writes. And so what we have here is a person reflecting on the state of the cultural tradition that he belongs to. This is useful for us to understand cultural life under the Ostrogoths as well, and cultural life under Theodoric in particular. And Boethius gives us an interesting picture, because on the one hand, the fact that this text even exists the fact that Boethius undertakes a translation project and has access to a living philosophical tradition speaks to the tremendous continuity with the deep classical past that still exists in Theodoric's Italy. But the way that Boethius talks about the state of that continuity suggests that this is a very, very precarious connection. And Boethius fears that it might be severed entirely if Boethius is executed. And so Boethius speaks about philosophy both as an active philosopher who very much is still engaged in the pursuit of philosophy, but also he speaks about somebody who's very concerned that he might be the last of his tradition. And so Boethius says, I was pondering in silence my condition and my situation, and I used my pen to set down so tearful a complaint. And as I was doing this and mourning my condition, there appeared standing over my head a woman's form, whose countenance was full of majesty, and her clothing was wrought of the finest thread by subtle workmanship brought to an indivisible piece. And this she'd woven with her own hands, as afterwards I learned by her own showing me. But the beauty of this was somewhat dimmed by the dullness of long neglect, as is seen in the smoke-grimed masks of our ancestors. On the border below was woven the symbol pi, and above that was to be read a theta, rendered as Q here because of the font. And between these two letters there could be marked by degrees, by which, as if the rungs of a ladder, ascent might be made through the lower principle to the higher principle. And yet the hands of rough men had torn this garment and snatched such morsels as they could from it, and in her right hand she carried books, and in her left was a scepter. Now the pi and the theta are Greek letters that represent practical and theoretical, praktike and theoretike, two divisions of philosophy. And what Boethius is saying here is philosophy is still there. And philosophy is still wonderful and brilliant, but ragged. Philosophy still exists, but in a really precarious fate. It's old, it's not degenerating, but it's not in prime condition, and it requires some sort of renewal. And so this is that moment. Boethius is the last philosopher in the West to know Plato for a long time. His translation project never actually gets to Plato, and this quotation from the Consolation of Philosophy sums up that cultural moment. Because philosophy is still alive, and it's alive as long as Boethius is alive. But it's not in a great condition. It's not really something that is robust. It's something that is kind of hanging on by a thread. And when Boethius is killed, he implies that will be the end of the philosophical tradition and the presence in the West. And that is actually, on some level, what comes to pass. And so when you look at this cultural moment, what you see is, philosophically, the tradition is alive. The continuity with the past is very much still there. But with Boethius and the execution of Boethius, you do have a severing of this. The West does not, after Boethius' death, get access to Plato again really until the 15th century, when Byzantine scholars bring this material over and people like Ficino in Florence start interacting with them. Other authors besides Boethius are working as well. And so while Boethius represents continuity with the philosophical past, and his execution represents a severing of the Gothic presence from that philosophical past, other people are working in this environment, and this severing doesn't actually occur. And so Boethius's relative Symmachus wrote a history of the 4th and 5th centuries. It was written like a traditional history. It doesn't seem to have been a wonderful work, but it seems to have resembled that of Ammianus, maybe even continued that of Ammianus. Unfortunately, the work is almost entirely lost. But Cassie Doris is another figure who we should turn our attention to, because Cassie Doris works under Theodoric, but after the Gothic regime falls and Italy is reabsorbed into the Eastern Empire, Cassie Doris works in Constantinople, and then he comes back to Italy. And the production that Cassie Doris engages in is really multifaceted. The Varii is a letter collection that's actually published after the end of the Gothic regime, after Italy has been reincorporated into the East, a process we'll talk about in a couple lectures. And Cassie Doris then represents not a severing of this connection with the Roman past, but very much continuity that persists even past the end of the Gothic regime. And so we're left, when we're thinking about Italy, with a question very much like the question we had with Gaul. Are we looking at a place that declines and falls, and we have sources that very much say it does? Or are we looking at a place that transforms and changes itself? And we have sources that very much make that case as well. So in Italy, we have sources that make both arguments. And then we have things that are sort of in between. Things like Boethius, where during Boethius's life, you can certainly argue for continuity. After Boethius's death, you can argue for severing of connections with the past. But I think in Italy, what you have you have the ability to make both arguments. You have the ability to use sources and say that there is a break with the past. There is a decline in certain aspects, notably philosophical culture. There are political elements and political changes, like the execution of Boethius, that very much reflect breaks with the past. But you also have things like Cassie Doris's Varii that show the past is very much alive. The measures that were used to demonstrate achievement are very much still in place. And Italy then becomes a very complicated picture, or it offers a very complicated picture, where arguments can be made on both sides and in both directions. And this, in a way, highlights the real challenge of using an absolute paradigm of decline or an absolute paradigm of transformation to describe this period. There are very much ways in which the Italian experience in the 5th century and into the early 6th century represents a decline of various aspects of Roman life. But there are other ways in which you can see certainly continuity, and maybe some could argue progress. The picture is complicated. No absolute model will work for Italy. And that's important to keep in mind as in the next lecture we turn to the situations in Spain and North Africa.